Greetings. Welcome to Equitable Assessment Strategies Empowering Every Student's Success. I'm so glad to be a part of the 2025 Virtual Math Summit. And let's go ahead and dig in. So firstly, I want to tell you that there is a handout to this session. And if you go to my website, sedaeducationalconsulting.com/handouts, you will be able to download a handout just to follow through. All righty. All right, I am Dr. Pamela Seda, CEO of Seda Educational Consulting, and I help leaders support teachers in meeting the needs of marginalized math learners so students are empowered to do the hard work of learning. I'm also the co-author of Choosing to See, a framework for equity in the math classroom, and several of the things that I will be talking about in the session are addressed in the book. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to. All right. I can't do a math session without doing some math, right? So I want to give you the opportunity to work a math problem. I call it the stargazing expedition problem. And so you are a part of a stargazing club that has recorded the number of visible stars in the night sky during each expedition as follows. Okay, so on night 1, you see those 3 stars. And on night 2, you see those 5 stars. And night 3, you see those stars, and so on. Okay, so if the same pattern continues, on which night will you spot exactly 87 stars? I want you to use words, numbers, tables, equations, and or pictures to support your answer. All right, so I'm going to give you a few minutes, but what I want you to do is I want you to pause the recording and then work on the problem. And once you've had a chance to work on the problem, then I want you to unpause and come back and let's talk about it. Righty. Hopefully you've had the chance to work the problem, and I want you to think about what were the emotions that came up for you? Please put that in the chat. What were some of the emotions that came up for you when you were doing that problem? I think some of you may have felt excitement. Some of you may have felt anxiety. Some of you may felt a combination of anxiety and frustration. Especially as teachers, we're often expected to already know how to do the problem. So if we weren't quite sure exactly what to do, some of us may have felt anxiety around that because we're teachers. We're supposed to automatically already know how to do everything. And the reason I wanted us to talk about the emotions that you felt when you did this mathematics is because I want you to understand that for students, math is emotional as well. And oftentimes we only think about the cognitive aspects of learning mathematics, but if we're not attending to those emotional aspects of learning, those emotions, sometimes those negative, both negative and positive emotions that come up and help normalize that in the math classroom, we are going to be missing the mark and missing a lot of learning opportunities for our students. So I just wanted us to think about that as we move forward in talking about equitable assessment strategies. So here's my goal for us today. One is I want you to be able to articulate the key components of effective assessment practices. I want you to be able to identify why so many traditional assessment practices are problematic. And then I want you to be able to understand how to replace some of those traditional assessment practices with ones that are more equitable. All right, so let's start. What is problematic with so many of our traditional assessment practices? Well, let's just say this. Traditional assessment practices are failing our students. So many of our students are just not being successful, and a lot of it really just has to do with the fact that what we're doing is not meeting their needs. So what's one of those problematic practices? First one, too many of our students believe that their performance in math is a reflection of their intelligence. So many students are made to feel like they're dumb And they think that if they can't answer the question quickly, that they're not smart. And because of all the years of our schooling practices that have um, communicated that to students, many of our students are not even willing to try because they don't want the fear of looking dumb. And that's just unfortunate because um, we if students believe that, then they're not going to put themselves in situations to where they have to struggle, to where they have to figure things out, because they think that only the smart kids are able to do the math. They think that if they're not able to look right at the problem and solve it, that something must be wrong with them and that they're not smart. And those are really the result of our assessment practices. Next problematic practice. Too many times, state tests define our district and school assessment questions, which are narrowly focused on specific skills that can be easily scored. And I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're like, well, we can't control what the state does, right? The state develops their test. And I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that we have to align our assessment questions to those narrowly focused skills. We have to remember at the state level, they're giving so many tests to so many people and have to get back quick results that they are oftentimes limited to just simply selected response questions that they can get the results back quickly. And what I'm saying is that that bar is too low for us as classroom teachers. We need to develop assessment items that require more cognitive demand, that make more of a cognitive demand of our students, and that demonstrate more of their thinking about the mathematics, not just simply focused on the answers. And too many times our state tests define our common assessments that we use in schools, and they're just too narrow for us to really figure out what kids are actually thinking about the problem and about the mathematics. Next problematic practice. Our obsession with grades is often at the expense of our students' learning. And what do I mean by that? So many times, students will look for the grade and not pay attention to feedback, right? There's lots of research that talks about the power of formative assessment and how assessing students while learning, during learning, and providing students feedback during the learning process is so much more effective than summative assessment. But students are so obsessed with grades. You know, I'm quite sure every one of you have had your students ask, is this going to be in the test? Because they're only worried about what the grading is. And let me just tell you what's problematic with that. They've done some research where they've given students feedback, and then they've given the same assessment item with feedback and a grade, and then they've given them assessments with just the grade. And what they noticed was that students learned the most with just the feedback. Even the assessments that were given back to them with feedback and grades, students only tend to pay attention to the grades and not the feedback and not on the things that will tell them how to get better. And I think part of the reason is when students see grades, they don't see that as assessment of their learning. They see that as assessment of them. You know, when they get an A, they think I'm excellent. When they get an F, they think I'm a failure. And so too many times they're focused on their identity. Those grades reflect on their identities as far as they're concerned, and they don't really focus on my learning and how I can improve and get better. Next problematic practice. We spend so much time in data meetings identifying who needs help that there's virtually no time left to discuss what we need to do to help them. And I would just say so many times in those data meetings, we're looking at, okay, who missed this question and who didn't miss this question, and who do I need to reteach, or who do I need to put into the intervention? And too many times, though, our students don't know what they need to do to get better. And I don't think we're reflective enough about exactly what it is that kids need, because we've run out of time trying to figure out who needs our help instead of what we need to do to help them. So, how can we replace our assessment practices with more equitable ones? Well, firstly, equity is getting what they need to be, everyone getting what they need to be successful. And I find that it's important for me to define what equity is in my terms because I would have never thought in the year 2024 that there would be people who would think equity was a bad word. So I know that there are people who have misrepresented what the term equity means. There are people who think equity means taking from the high kids and giving to the low kids. And I don't mean that at all. I say equity is everyone getting what they need to be successful. But the reality is, we know that everyone doesn't need the same thing, that what one student needs may not be the same thing as what another student needs. And that we need to be mindful of that and know our students so that we can give them what they need because we've taken the time to figure out what they need. So, how do we know whether we've accomplished our goal? Well, this is what I say equity's goal is. Our goal is to create learning spaces where it is no longer possible to predict math achievement and participation based solely on student characteristics such as race, class, ethnicity, sex, beliefs, and proficiency in the dominant language. Unfortunately, in our country, these student characteristics have for too long been better predictors of student success than actually instruction. And so this definition just means we have work to do, and that's all. And I just feel like us, people like you coming to learn and attending these sessions and us putting our heads together, we can accomplish and get closer to our goal. All right, so one of the ways that I think is real important for us to be able to engage in more equitable assessment practices is by using the ICU Care Equity Framework. This is a framework that came out of my doctoral work at Georgia State University, and it actually started in the multicultural teacher education literature. And I decided to use it when I saw someone use it for research with a teacher who was teaching English language arts. It was an English ELA middle school classroom. And when I saw them use it for an ELA classroom, I said, well, I think I can use it for a math classroom. And so I operationalized it for mathematics and then was able to later, when I was using it with teachers, one of my teachers said, Dr. Seda, this is really good, but you need to help us remember this. And so I went back to the drawing board and out came ICU Care, ICUCARE. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those principles or each of those letters represent a principle. And then we'll talk more about the A part into more detail. All right, first one, include others as experts. Create classroom environments that extend beyond the teacher as the sole authority to develop competence and confidence in others as experts, including the students themselves. And the reason why this is so important for equitable math instruction is because the majority of classrooms I go into, the teachers are doing the bulk of the work. The teachers are doing the bulk of the talking, the teachers are doing the bulk of the writing, and most students are at best passively taking notes and at worst checked out. And so I realized that this mode of instruction would be okay if teachers were taking the test, because who does the most talking is doing the most learning. So what we have to do in order to implement this principle is to decenter the role of the teacher and build the competence and confidence of students. And that means two shifts are going to have to be made. One is we're going to have to shift our definition of what it means to be an expert. Instead of an expert being the person who knows the most about a topic, an expert is now anyone who can contribute to the collective knowledge of the group. And if you are a person that can contribute to the collective knowledge of the group, then you can be an expert. But the other shift that has to happen is instead of seeing the classroom as a collection of individual learners, we now shift a classroom as understanding that they are a community of learners. Well, every individual is not only responsible for their own learning, but they're also responsible for contributing to the learning of their classmates. So redefining expert and shifting to a community of learners are the crux characteristics of this principle, include others as experts. All right, the next principle is be critically conscious. That's the first C. And it means to take the time to understand how negative stereotypes impact your students and actively work to erase the effects of those negative stereotypes on the educational outcomes of marginalized students. The reason this principle is so important is because oftentimes I hear teachers say things like, I don't see color, I only see students. And I really think they're very well intentioned. What they mean is that I don't discriminate and I'm not prejudiced against students because of certain race or gender or things like that. But the reason that's problematic is because stereotypes impact us all, and we all have stereotypes about the various identities that we may have. So, for example, there are stereotypes about women and girls not being good at math. There are stereotypes about Black people being lazy. There's stereotypes about ELL learners that they can't learn math because they can't read. There's all kinds of stereotypes about our identities. And if we don't recognize the stereotypes about the identities, then we can't help our students overcome them. So, as a Black woman, all of us Black women do not think alike. There's no monolith. I'm not like every other Black woman. But what we do all have in common is we all have to manage the stereotypes about Black women. And so, unless we can acknowledge the identities that our students carry with them, we can't help them overcome those stereotypes or the negative impacts of those stereotypes on their educational outcomes. So, that is why being critically conscious is so important. All right, next principle, you understand your students well. Learn about your students, their families, and their communities for the purpose of improving instruction. That means not making assumptions. Now, understanding your students well means we need to understand our students beyond just being students. Like they are full human beings before they ever set foot in our classroom. And it's acknowledging the humanity of our students. It's acknowledging the importance of relationships, not only the relationships that we carry with our students, but the relationships that students have with their families and their communities. And understand that every student not only represents themselves, but they represent their family and they represent a community that they come from. And that the more you learn about their families, the more you learn about their communities, the better you can teach them, the better informed you will be about what kinds of activities that you might be able to use inside the classroom to engage them. So understanding your students well really does mean understanding who they are. What are their passions? What are their desires? What are their goals for beyond school? And understanding that can really help you teach them math better. All right, next, use culturally relevant curricula. That's the second C. Use instructional materials in ways that help students see themselves as doers of mathematics and help them overcome the negative stereotypes and messages regarding who is and who isn't mathematically smart. So let's be honest, we have to understand that math does have an image problem. When you think about mathematicians, you think about some Albert Einstein looking person, somebody who's socially inept, somebody who may remind you of Stephen Urkel. And most of our students do not identify with people like that. So we really have to think about how do we revamp math or how do we market our image around mathematics so students can actually see themselves engaged in mathematics. Well, I have this picture here because one is this event happened at the National Organization of Minority Architects. And firstly, these are not people that you normally think of when you think of architects, just like oftentimes students don't see themselves as mathematicians. But particularly, I want to talk about the young lady in purple who happens to be my daughter. And when she was in elementary school, I noticed that she was very artistic. Now, I was a math major and my husband was a computer science major. So math and science, STEM were non-negotiables in my house. But the fact that she was so artistic really piqued my interest. And I remember saying to her sometime in upper elementary, I think architecture would be a great field for you to go into because it's a really good blend of math and science and art. She was like, nope. She wasn't remotely interested, probably because I suggested it. What does mom know? But in middle school, she did a field trip with her Girl Scout troop. And I live in Atlanta, so they went to Georgia Tech, and she heard this African American female architect speak to them. And when she came home, she was like, Mom, I'm going to go to Georgia Tech and I'm going to be an architect. And of course, I was really excited, didn't express too much excitement because I didn't want to change her mind. But I am proud to say that she is now one of the 0.2% of licensed architects that are Black women. And yes, I share that story as a proud mom, but more importantly, for us to see the work that we have ahead of us. That just like it wasn't until she saw someone that looked like her that she thought it was possible for her, for many of our students, they need to see people who look like them being successful in mathematics. Because if they don't, no matter what you tell them, you can say all day that you can be successful in math, but they won't believe us if they don't see people who look like them being successful in mathematics. So that is the second C. All right, A, assess, activate, and build on prior knowledge. Value the prior knowledge that students bring to the classroom, both personal and cultural, and leverage that knowledge as a resource for creating new knowledge. And this principle really kind of sums up what we're going to talk about for the rest of the session about assessment. But I wanted to just kind of talk about how all three of these are important. Assess is real important because we just need to figure out what do kids already know about a subject. And before you start thinking about those diagnostic tests that you give at the beginning of the year, that's not what I'm talking about. Those tests oftentimes make kids feel dumb and stupid right off the bat because they're coming off a summer break and they take this diagnostic test. They've never been taught the material and they just feel all this anxiety around the fact that, oh, I don't know this. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about there's lots of different strategies of figuring out what kids know. I like a lot of those classroom routines like, what do you notice? What do you wonder? Which one doesn't belong? Would you rather? Those are low risk activities. So there's really no right or wrong answer, but you're able to figure out what kids know about a topic. And so this means that we need to value that prior knowledge that students bring to the classroom, both personal and cultural. And so take advantage of that informal knowledge that students bring with them and leverage that to connect to the new topics. Mathematics is taught so abstractly. And unfortunately, if we teach it that way, we're not working with how the brain works. Mike Wormley, at a session I attended, he said, nothing gets into long-term memory if it's not connected to something that's already there. And so that is why teachers need to be able to connect to even the informal knowledge that students have. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably have said things like, oh, your middle school teacher didn't teach you this, or your elementary teacher didn't teach you this, or your first grade teacher didn't teach you this. And hopefully you've never done anything like that, but I have. And I just never really thought about the impact that would have on my kids. Were they now going to be willing to embrace the work and do the work and engage in the productive struggle of learning math if they think that, they're now less than or something's wrong with them because their prior knowledge is not where I think it should be? So the next thing is activate, is understanding the realization that there is knowledge that needs to be activated, that they may have already learned it. Just because they can't immediately recall it doesn't mean they don't know it, and that we need to engage in activities that are going to activate that prior knowledge and make that a normal part of the learning process. And then the last part is just to acknowledge that all kids are not going to come with the prior knowledge we think they should have, and that building that prior knowledge, especially in a community of learners, is really important, and we should make that as an everyday part of our classroom, not making kids feel guilty. Because if we do not activate or build on that prior knowledge that students have, they're not going to be able to access the new content. Now, I'm not talking about going over doing a whole classroom of adding fractions before you add multiply fractions. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying maybe do one example with a what do you notice, what do you wonder? Give a visual representation of the mathematics. Ask them, would you rather, which one doesn't belong? And then use that to build the prior knowledge and connect to the learning that you're getting ready to teach. All right, release control. That's the R. Empower your students to take ownership of their learning by focusing on sense making and allow them to make choices about things that are important to them in the classroom. All right. So one of the things that, well, there's two things that need to happen in order for us to be able to release control. Because we can't empower our students if we're trying to hold so tightly to everything. So one is we need to focus on sense making and not just on answer getting. So much of the time that we spend in classrooms, in traditional classrooms, is spent on getting kids to get right answers. And that is very short-lived if it doesn't make sense. And so kids need to engage in sense making for it to be retained. Remember, I talked about nothing gets in long-term memory if it's not connected to something that's already there. Well, the sense making part is where kids are able to connect to things that are already in their long-term memory. And the last part here is give kids choices about things that are important to them. And it's amazing about things that we can give them choices about. Like I used to, if I found that less is more. So if I was giving an assignment, I might give them 2 different or 3 different problems and say, choose one of them, which one you would like to solve. And I would even give them the answer and say, okay, your assignment is to give me the work that supports this answer. And I found that giving kids choices engage them so much more, or even letting them select the writing prompt. Like in the end of the day, I would give them 3 different writing prompts and I say, choose one to write on. And it's just amazing the different ways that we can give students choice to release control. All right, the last one, expect more. Hold high expectations for all students and avoid deficit views of diverse learners. And this is one of the ways that stereotypes show up in how we work with students from marginalized groups, because of those assumptions that sometimes we make as a result of stereotypes. We often lower our expectations for students, and we don't engage them in the very activities that can make them smarter mathematically. And so what happens is, because we continue to not give them those learning opportunities because of our lowered expectations, they fall further and further behind. In the words of Ken Williams, he says, once you label a kid low, they're going to perform low, and we're going to teach them low. And so this means just helping communicate to students that learning is a journey, and that when we're first learning something, we're all novices, that none of us know how to do something well when we're first starting out, and that we're communicating the journey aspect of learning. And so that we keep the bar high for all of our kids. And this doesn't mean that we don't recognize students' weaknesses. What it means is we don't define students in terms of their weaknesses. It means we find out what they're good at, what their strengths are first, what do they already know, and then figure out how to use their strengths to address the things that they don't know. So the last one is expect more. So as I said earlier, we're going to spend a little bit more time on the A part, assess, activate, and build on prior knowledge. All right. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to understand that you can use games, you can use collaborative activities. There's all kinds of ways that you can find out what kids know. And that's what simply assessment is. But it's also giving them feedback on what they need to do next. And so we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about specific ways to do that. So when we're talking about formative assessment, it's not just about what the teacher does. If students can't answer these 3 questions, then we're not meeting their needs, not meeting their academic needs. So what are those 3 questions? And what are these 3 important necessary components for assessment? So 1, kids need to know, what did I do well? They need to know what they did well. They should be able to articulate what they did well. Then number 2, what areas still need improvement? And then lastly, what specific actions can I take to get better? And this one is really important, especially for students who've had a history of low math achievement, because they feel like they don't know what to do. They've tried everything. I've studied. I can't tell you how many times I've heard students, I studied all night and I still failed. And they think that it's something wrong with them. They think that they just can't learn math because they don't know what specific actions they can take to get better. And if kids don't know these three things, they can't act to get better. And so that's what we have to figure out is how do I empower our students to be able to do these three things? All right, so this is the crux of how I've done it. So I borrowed this from science, claim evidence reasoning, CER, to clearly define for students what I expect for them when solving problems. And like I said, it started in science, but then I adapted it specifically for my math classroom. So let's talk about what that might look like. So the first thing is claim. What is your answer to the problem? And so we're going to go back and revisit that math problem that I asked you to do. And this is going to make so much more sense to you if you did take the time to do the problem. So if we're looking at this, I want to know what makes something an answer proficient. A complete and correct answer is provided, including correct units, and the answer to a word problem is given as a complete sentence. So if you're looking here, it says, if I just said you would see 87 stars on the 43rd night, then that is a complete and correct answer. The correct answer was 43, it's 43rd night, but if I just said 43, then that would not be complete. It would be correct, but it would not be complete. All right, so this is the expectation like that they need to be able to stake their claim. Now, this has been, I don't know if you've had students do this, but many times I've had students have all this work, but I don't know where their answer is. So I've had to really emphasize what is your claim, right? And that is the answer to the problem. All right, next, evidence. How did you get your answer? I want to know your thinking. I want you to make your thinking visible about how did you get your answer. So what makes evidence proficient? Calculations, equations, formulas, tables, graphs, and or drawings that appropriately and sufficiently support the answer are provided. Appropriate and sufficient. And then evidence that the answer was checked for accuracy is also provided. So I'm specifically telling kids what is acceptable evidence. I have found that you have to tell kids how to show their work. I used to say, show your work. And for them, they would give me their chicken scratch. And they didn't understand really what I was wanting them to do is make their thinking visible. And so now I started saying, make your thinking visible. And that's part of the evidence. So it needs to be both appropriate and sufficient. Sometimes students put down what is appropriate, but they don't put enough information for me to be able to follow their thinking. And so that is the expectation I have. It needs to be both appropriate as well as sufficient. And then I want evidence that the answer was checked because humans, we make errors. Mistakes are all a part of the learning process. So I want my kids to know that I expect you to check it. All right. And so let's take a look at this evidence. So they gave 357 and then went to 87 and said each time 2 more stars are added to the previous night. If I continue the pattern, it will get to 87 stars on the 43rd night. All right. And I say this evidence is not proficient. Why? So one of the reasons I said it wasn't proficient was because I'm not sure where the 87 came from. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not sure where the 43 came from. It tells me that they continue the pattern, and I see the beginning, and what they said is 2 more stars are added, but I don't know how they got to 43. That evidence is not there. So this is appropriate, but not sufficient. Also, there's no evidence that they checked it. All right. Reasoning. Why does your solution process work? Now, I know traditionally when we talk about reasoning, sometimes we use the words reasoning and show your evidence interchangeably, but I'm separating those two because I want kids to be able to articulate the math terms and the vocabulary that supports their evidence. All right. So their reasoning is not so much an explanation And it can be an explanation. And if they do have an explanation, that can be exemplary. But I'm looking for, can they name the math? Can they name the math vocabulary that they used? That's what I'm looking for in the reasoning. Why does your solution process work? So, what makes it proficient? Appropriate mathematical definitions, formulas, rules, principles, and or theorems that support the evidence are identified. And students need to be able to say those words. Why? Because that's going to help them recall it when it gets into long-term memory and they need to use it. Those terms will be able to easily help us recall that information that's in there for them to be able to use it and build on it for future learning. So now I've made a distinction between proficient and exemplary here. If they can name those terms, that's proficient. If they can give me an explanation of why that solution works, that's exemplary. And let me just tell you why I've made this distinction. Because I think one of the things that I've liked about Ken Williams' work is he says that you can't have equity if you haven't defined what is the minimum level for all students. What is that level that you need to get all students to? Students can get beyond it, but what's that minimum level that all students must reach? And so that is why I've said I want all students to be able to name those definitions, name the math, because it's important for their future learning to be able to recall. Now, I want some students to be able to explain it, and that's exemplary. But I think the proficient is the minimum level that all students need to get to. All right, so let's take a look at this reasoning. So they say each time, two more stars. So here they have evidence. They got the 2x plus 1 equals 87. They have the equation, and that comes from the two more stars. So we got S equals 43. It wasn't quite clear to me on the evidence piece where that one came from, but that's okay. They provided more than from the other. But now I'm taking a look at the reasoning piece, okay, separately from the evidence. So when I'm looking at the reasoning piece, I'm looking for where are they identifying, what math terms are they using that they are reflected in the evidence. So I see they linear equation because they used a linear, they knew that it was a linear equation. They also used the term average rate of change. And they also identify properties of equality. They understand that they were using properties of equality to solve that. So in this case, because they gave an explanation, they didn't just list the terms, they identified those terms, but they also gave an explanation of how they use those terms. I would say this is exemplary reasoning. Now, mind you, I'm looking at reasoning apart from evidence. I do think with the evidence, they could add a little bit more meat there so that I could understand where did the one come from. But as far as the reasoning and the math vocabulary, they are using it appropriately and using appropriate vocabulary, and they named it. So I would be very pleased with this reasoning. All right, so I do want to say that I know that most of you are elementary teachers and you're saying, oh, I wouldn't have used algebra to solve that. And that's totally fine. This is just an example of how I would have approached it. But there are many different ways, and whatever reasoning your students use and whatever way you use, that's the point, is that they need to be able to provide evidence. And I was just giving that as an example. All right. So how do I use this in a classroom? How do I use CER in a classroom? Well, I've used this to create a single point rubric. Now, one of the reasons I love a single point rubric is because the focus is on what is proficient. They make it very clear. So in the middle column, I spell out all those things that I shared with you earlier. I put in the middle column, make it very clear for my students what is proficient. All right. And so then what's not proficient, I leave blank. Why do I leave that blank? One is I have found that there's so many different ways that kids can go left when it comes to meeting a problem. And for me to decide how far below proficient you are is not important to me. Because in my mind, equity means what is the minimum bar I need to get all kids to? So I don't need to know how far below proficient you are. Either it's proficient or you're not yet proficient. Notice I have the word yet there. All right. And so then I will put, that's where in that first column, I'll put what makes it not proficient. But before I do that, I highlight what is proficient. What are kids doing Right. I highlight. That's where I start. So remember that first question we said, what kids need to know, what did they do well? It's highlighted on their rubric. I just highlight the parts that they did. And so they can immediately look at the rubric based on the work and say, oh, the highlighted parts is what I did well. And so then it says what areas need improvement. Well, the unhighlighted parts need improvement. So they see that instantly by looking at. So those first two questions are automatically answered for students when they get this rubric as a result of doing the work. So then the last thing is, what are some specific actions I can take to improve? That's where you give them that feedback there. And that goes in that first column. And it's real important that you practice this because you'll get better and better at giving feedback. But one of the things is you want to make sure you're not overly directive, but that you give them enough information that they can act on it. If it's too ambiguous, they don't know what to do with the information. But if it's overly directive, you'll be doing the thinking for the kids, and so then you'll be robbing them of their thinking. And so there's a real sweet spot that you really only get to by doing lots of practice with this. All right, so some of you may be saying, well, how do I turn that into a grade? And so one of the things that um, I know, and I was in a district, I had to give 3 grades per week. And so grading was something that I had to do. I had to turn things into a number grade. So this is how I did it, is if it was proficient, they got an 85. If it was proficient and they had exemplary reasoning, they got a 95. If it was proficient, exemplary reasoning, and unique and creative in some way, then they got 100. And so some of you say, well, what do you do if it's not proficient? I give it back to them and they keep working to it till it becomes proficient. Because my goal is to help them understand that you're not proficient yet and that learning is a journey and that the first time you do something, most of the time, very seldom is it going to be proficient, and that's okay. That means I give students many, many opportunities to get feedback on their work. Do I have to be the only one giving them feedback? Absolutely not. They can get feedback from their classmates. They can get feedback during class discussions while they're doing work at the board. They can get feedback in a variety of ways. So the key is giving students many opportunities to be able to be proficient. Now, you can't do this with every single standard, right? But that's why as I've often said, less is more. You do this with those big ideas, those priority standards, those problem-solving standards, those application standards, those really things that are important standards. That's what you do this with. And they will eventually figure out how to engage in those supporting standards to get to that high place, to get to the proficient, to get to the proficient plus exemplary, or even get to the 100. So this is a way that I've been able to grade students and keep them motivated to keep learning. So why go this deeply? Why make them, in addition to giving a claim, be able to provide evidence and reasoning when oftentimes on your state tests, they only have to give a claim? Well, there's 2 reasons. One had to do with how the brain works. And remember, I said nothing gets into long-term memory until it's connected to something that's already there. Because the reality, if so much of what we learn and at the end of the day is still in our students' short-term memory. And we have to figure out how to get it into long-term memory. And one of those other ways of getting things into long-term memory is to go deeper with the learning. The deeper we go, the more neurons that are being connected, and the stronger those neurons are being connected because they're going back and forth over them. So I liken it to time being the waves that come over the footprints that we're making in the sand. And the learning that's happening in class are those footprints that we're making in the sand. And we want them to be deep, because if they're not deep, the first wave that comes over them is going to wash it away. But if they're deeper and we keep making them deeper, then they have a chance of being sustained and going into long-term memory. So that's one reason. Second reason is it's important for us to overtrain. Now, what do I mean by that? I ran cross country when I was in high school. Cross country was 3.2 miles. And when we were training for our state meet, we were running 8 miles a day. Now, why in the world would we run 8 miles when our race was only 3.2 miles? Well, it's the same reason that athletes oftentimes run with ankle weights. It's when you overtrain, when the event actually happens, then it's going to be a piece of cake. When they take those weights off, or when I've been used to running 8 miles, when I only have to run 3.2 miles, it's a piece of cake. I'm not struggling at all. It's much easier for me. And we find that if our kids are taught at the CER level, if they're used to practicing giving evidence, if they're used to giving that reasoning, and they're used to thinking at that deeper level, when they only have to provide a claim on the state test, it'll be so much easier for them. So it's really important for us not to just stay at the level of our state test, but that we overtrain and that we teach our kids to think more deeply. All right. And that's also connected to having higher expectations for our kids. Too many times, because of stereotypes, we lower our expectations and we think that, oh, so and so can't do this, and not realizing that we're actually um, impeding their learning. We're actually taking away from them the actual opportunities that are things that are going to make them smarter. So, this is really expecting more from our marginalized math learners. All right, so that brings us to a call to action. Now, I've given you some great information, and I want you to think about what is what are you going to do differently as a result of this information that you've heard? Because if you don't do something with this information, it's going to be gone, like those waves, those footprints on the sand. If you don't do something in the information, that information that I just got you is going to go away. So I want you to think about, what are you going to do differently? Plus, you need to do something differently so that it benefits your students. So I want you to think about, what is that? And then after you think about what are you going to do differently, I want you to think about what impact you think these changes will have on your students. And the reason I'm asking you to think about the impact on your students is because when you get back to your school environments and your work environments, it's going to be very easy to just go back to doing things the same old way, because change is hard. And if you focus on your students, though, and that's going to be your why am I changing? This is going to help motivate you to actually implement that change, because you're going to understand this is the impact it's going to have on my kids. This is my why for doing this change. And then lastly, I want you to think about, who will you ask to be a thought partner with you as you try to implement these changes? Just somebody that can ask you, and you said, you were going to do this next week. How did it go? Or how can I support you? Or just even somebody to bounce some ideas, even if it didn't go well, you can say, hey, I bombed this. What do you think? And they can give you feedback. So I just think it's real important that you think about answering these 3 questions, because that's my call to action. Now, because I'm a teacher, I also want to know how you process this information. So if you do me a favor, if you place your responses on the call to action form, which is going to be on the handout that I said that is available for this workshop, if you give your responses on the call to action form, you will receive a free copy of the CER single point rubric. I'll send that to you. I'll also send you a poster with the ICU care framework on it. So I'll send you both of those items if you would indulge me and just put your responses on the call to action form, which will be on the handout. All right, so I just want to take this time to also let you know that I am the president of the Benjamin Banneker Association, which is an equity affiliate of NCTM, and we're committed to improving math education for Black children. You do not have to be Black to be a part of this organization, just committed to improving math education for Black students. So I invite you to visit our website, benjaminbannekerassociation.org. I have included a link to our website on the handout. You can also get there by entering bbamath.org. And I would just hope that you would check us out and learn more about us. All right. Well, thank you for our time together. I do just want to let you know that ICU Care is a registered trademark of Seda Educational Consulting, and the digital handout provided in this session is for your professional use only. Feel free to share with your team, but please do not distribute or modify the content without permission. Thank you for respecting our work and promoting equitable math instruction. And once again, if you have not already downloaded the handout, you can go to my website, sedaeducationalconsulting.com/handouts, and there you can get the handout for this session. So hope you learned some things, a few things that you're going to try out. And thank you very much for attending my session.